This Sunday morning with Laura Kuenssberg.
I'm here to tell you that I am totally 100% on it, and it is going to be okay, and we are going to get through this.
That's what the Prime Minister told us. But with the economy stuttering and mayhem in Moscow, after 8 months of Rishi Sunak's time in office, is that really true?
Abroad, with his allies, he has to handle a dangerous mess. At home, he has promised again and again to bring inflation down.
Inflation is what erodes people's savings and pushes up prices and ultimately makes them poorer.
Yet the speed of price rises is stubbornly high.
We still think the rate of inflation is going to come down, but it's taking a lot longer than we expected.
He said NHS waiting lists would fall.
I hope you've heard the good news.
But the number of people stuck waiting for treatment is at an all-time high.
There's over 7 million patients on the waiting list at the moment, and that's only expected to grow because of our workforce crisis.
And he said that he would stop political chaos.
This government will have integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
But controversy has never been far from his door, whether he likes it or not. And the Prime Minister even dodged a vote on Boris Johnson's conduct. So our big question this morning: how is Rishi Sunak faring in number 10?
We sat down in the number 10 garden to talk about the rebellion in Russia, more staff for the NHS, and how on earth thousands of families are going to pay their mortgages in the months to come. What is the alternative? Labour's Lisa Nandy will join us from Salford. To make sense of what's going on in Russia, no one better than Steve Rosenberg, the BBC's editor there. And it is Sunday, so there's always room for a bit of light relief. We'll talk to the reluctant star of this year's Glastonbury, Rick Astley, on whether he's become cool at last. Morning. It is a big day, the first time since January that we've sat down for a long conversation with Rishi Sunak. He was keen to talk about his plan for staff in the NHS. We were keen to put your big questions on the economy. But the last 24 hours have reminded everyone that we live in an unpredictable world. Here are the pictures of Yevgeny Prigozhin, whose attempted coup seems to have failed in Russia. We'll talk about that in a second, but with me at the table to talk it through, Marina Litvinenko, whose husband Alexander, a Russian dissident, died after a poisoning thought to be approved by Putin, Ben Elton, the comedian and author, and Luke Trill, pollster with his finger on public opinion. Welcome to you all. The front pages of the newspapers, no surprise, are all trying to work out what's next in Russia. The Mirror says Putin has been pushed to the brink. The Sunday Telegraph says Wagner mutineers have turned back after striking a deal with Putin. And the Sunday Times says that Putin has been humiliated by this mutiny. Marina, you know brutally what the Putin regime was capable of course, with your husband losing his life. When you saw what looked like a coup yesterday coming to him, what did you think?
First of all, I talked to a lot of people here in UK who've been in one way excited. Something started to be change or moving in Russia, but somebody was worried because Prigozhin is not a hero and he's a criminal and he committed a lot of bad things in Ukraine and you can't trust to this person. And this was all, again, a mess in Russia. But was a very special message. Putin is not a person who controls anything in Russia. And this image of a president who make all these brutal things, it means, but he only just for frightening people, but not controlling this.
So it shows his authority is not what you might sometimes believe it to be. I mean, Ben, I know you watch politics closely. What went through your mind when you saw it?
Well, goodness, I watch it as closely as any interested person. And I mean, this is geopolitics, and Russia's got the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So I suppose that one of the first and most selfish things I thought was, you know, chaos in a country that precariously well armed is a terrifying thing. I mean, I grew up under the threat of the mushroom cloud and World War III, and suddenly it all seems to be coming back closer to home.
So a scary moment for you. I mean, Luke, I know one of the things in this country is that people have been really supportive of the war in Ukraine. But do you sense that that is still solid?
What's absolutely fascinating about people's attitudes to the war is we sort of thought, you know, after a difficult winter here, the cost of living crisis, that support might start to fade. But actually the opposite's happened. People are more resolved than ever in our polling that actually not only does Ukraine need to win, but actually it's important to the UK that Ukraine wins.
Really interesting to see that support holding up despite the fact that it's all been going on for a long time. More with you guys a bit later. But the situation is still quite unclear. It's certain for the Prime Minister here and other world leaders that they have to grapple with these events unfolding. But what is not certain is exactly what has happened. It appeared to be a dramatic coup with troops from the mercenary group Wagner on their way to the capital. But then suddenly it all appeared to be off. And they left Rostov, a city that they had taken seemingly just hours before. So to get to the bottom of it, we spoke a bit earlier to the BBC's Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg.
That's a question I ask all the time about what's happening in Russia. I mean, yeah, astonishing 24 hours. At one point, you know, we were talking about this rebellion, the spectre of civil war in Russia, and then suddenly in the evening, a deal had been done between the Kremlin and the Wagner mercenary group, according to which Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, would have to leave Russia and go to Belarus, but wouldn't be prosecuted, and Wagner fighters who'd taken part in this mutiny would not be prosecuted. They would go back to base. End of the potential confrontation. And now we're just trying to sift through all of this and work out what it was and what it means for Vladimir Putin and for Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Tell us about Prigozhin. I mean, we discussed him actually with the Russian ambassador in the UK on the programme a couple of weeks ago, but he's become this hugely important figure. Can you describe what he is and what he represents?
Oh, he's a hugely colourful figure, right? I mean, this is someone who started off in the 1990s in St. Petersburg selling hot dogs. And then became a restaurateur, got a catering business, got government contracts with that, and then went sort of from food into fixing for the Kremlin. So he became a kind of shady Mr. Fix-It for Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, setting up internet troll farm, a private mercenary group if the Kremlin needed military help fighting in Syria or fighting in Ukraine. He's become an important figure. He became an important figure for the Kremlin. But in recent months, he's become increasingly vocal in his criticism of the Russian military leadership over how the war in Ukraine has been fought. And that really burst out into the open in the last few days and reached a climax with this attempted mutiny.
Is he really out of the picture, though, now? I mean, I know it's confusing, but do you have a sense of what might be next?
It's very difficult to know what's going to come next because I don't think we know all the details of the agreement that was reached between the Kremlin and Wagner. And perhaps in the coming days more will emerge. For Mr. Prigozhin, the aim of this rebellion was to get rid of the Russian defense minister and the chief of the general staff. They have been fighting it out in a war of words for months now. We don't know whether those two very powerful figures in the Russian military will keep their jobs or not. If they don't, that would represent a major victory for Mr. Prigozhin.
And for Vladimir Putin, I mean, he's still there, still in power, and yet surely he must have been weakened by this.
Yeah, I think he doesn't come out of this looking very strong at all. If you look at the ease with which the Wagner mercenaries sort of waltzed into Rostov in southern Russia and took control of the main military sites there, Mr. Putin went on national television and came up with strong words talking about betrayal and treachery and how Russia has been stabbed in the back. And yet by the end of the day, yesterday, Mr. Prigozhin, who clearly Vladimir Putin had labelled a traitor, had all the charges dropped against him. So I think at the end of all of this, although we don't exactly know what is going on, what will happen next, President Putin doesn't look particularly strong after this.
And a brief word, Steve, what do you think the consequence could be here for Ukraine? I mean, an opportunity for them?
It all depends what's going to happen next. While Russia is consumed with its domestic problems, domestic issues, I suppose Ukraine will see that as an opportunity.
Steve, thank you so much for speaking to us this morning. Excellent to have you on the show.
Thanks.
Well, we are all already living with the consequences of some of the turmoil in Russia, energy prices, inflation, and because of that, interest rates here going up and up and up. Whether or not you have a mortgage, you know what it all means. Money just doesn't stretch as far. In his first long TV interview for a while, the Prime Minister told me inflation was enemy number one. And he talked about his plans that will be unveiled this week to train more staff for the NHS. But with such pressure on the country's purse strings, would he acknowledge how tough things are for millions? Speaking yesterday, what did he think was what happened in Russia, a coup? Prime Minister, what's happening in Russia is clearly very significant. Do you think this might be a coup against Vladimir Putin?
Well, we've been monitoring for a while now the potentially destabilising impacts of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. We're keeping a close eye on the situation as it's evolving on the ground as we speak. We're in touch with our allies, and in fact, I'll be speaking to some of them later today. But the most important thing I'd say is for all parties to be responsible and to protect civilians, and that's about as much as I can say at this moment.
The Ministry of Defence, though, has said online this morning this is the most significant threat to the Russian state in recent times. Is that right? How do you see it?
As I said, we've been monitoring for a while the potential of Russia's illegal invasion in Ukraine to be destabilising, and that's obviously you've seen the situation as it's developing. We're keeping a close eye on that. We're in touch with our allies as the situation evolves. I'll be speaking to some of them later today, and the most important thing is for all parties to behave responsibly and to protect civilian lives.
When people look at this, I mean, is it good news or bad news that Vladimir Putin's been challenged?
Again, it's an evolving situation. And I think the right thing at this juncture is for us to make sure that we're on top of it, that we're in touch with our allies, which we are, and I'll be speaking to them later today, and that we call on all parties to exercise responsibility and to protect civilian lives. I think that's the most important thing for us in the UK to be doing at this juncture.
Have you heard from President Zelensky about what's going on yet?
As I said, I'm in touch with our allies. I'll be speaking to some of them later today, as you would expect us to be coordinated on a situation like this, but it is evolving as we speak.
And just last question, if there are British citizens remaining in Moscow or in Russia, for example, we know a lot of people obviously have left, but do you have advice for British citizens in Russia at the moment while this is going on?
We've had long-standing travel advice against travel to Russia. That's on the Foreign Office website. People should regularly check that, but it has been we've had long-standing advice advising against travel to Russia for all the obvious reasons, but people should keep checking the Foreign Office website for updates.
Okay. Now this week, you will, after a long time, publish your plans for staffing in the NHS over the long term, that workforce plan as it's described. Now we've seen a draft of that plan that says essentially that you need to double the number of training places for doctors and nurses. Is that what you're going to do?
Well, at the beginning of the year, I set out 5 priorities for the country. One of them was to cut waiting lists, and that's why shortly after becoming Prime Minister, we injected more money into the NHS, record funding, in fact, to help the NHS do that. But I also want to make sure that the NHS is modernised and it's fit for the future, and that's why we're going to do things differently. And this week, we're going to do something that no government has ever done. It's going to be one of the most significant announcements in the history of the NHS, and that is to make sure that it has a long-term workforce plan so that we can hire the doctors, nurses and GPs that we need, not just today, but for years into the future, to provide the care that we all need.
So what does that mean? And if I'm a normal patient, what difference will it make and when?
So what it will represent is the largest expansion in training and workforce in the NHS's history, but it's also going to draw on the latest innovations and techniques to streamline the process from classroom to clinic, because it's right that healthcare adapts and evolves as our needs change, and it will be supporting the NHS. This is the NHS's plan, and it's right that we back them to do it, and it will mean people can have confidence that the doctors and nurses and GPs that we all need will be there, and that we can reduce our reliance on foreign-trained healthcare professionals. I think that's something everyone wants to see. For the first time, this plan shows how we can do that.
But when will ordinary patients see a difference? Because, it takes 7 years to train a doctor, 3 years to train a nurse. So again, if I'm an ordinary patient, when will I see a difference?
Well, so I think we should separate into the short term and the long term. I'm a Prime Minister that wants to make a difference today, and that's why cutting waiting lists is one of my 5 priorities, and people can already see that difference. Last year, we practically eliminated the number of people waiting 2 years for treatment. Recently, we've virtually eliminated the number of people waiting 1.5 years. If you look at ambulance response times, A&E waiting times, they've improved considerably from Christmas when they were particularly challenging. But you're right, it's also we take the long-term decisions for the years into the future.
You say that what you're doing on waiting lists is already working. In actual fact, the overall number of people waiting is the highest that it has ever been. Targets on routine waiting lists have been missed. Targets on cancer care have been missed. You can pick some selective statistics, but overall, the experience that people are having on waiting lists is dreadful in many cases.
It's because we've had a pandemic, Laura, and the backlog that ensued was always going to take some time to work through.
But many waiting lists were going in the wrong direction well before the pandemic.
I've been here for just over 6 months, and in that time, we've practically eliminated, as I said, last year, the number of people waiting 2 years for treatment. We've just recently practically eliminated the number of people waiting 1.5 years, and you've seen an enormous improvement in A&E and ambulance waiting times
January,
since they were particularly bad. Yes, that's right. And it will take time for the overall. It will take time for the overall waiting list to come down, because as we've recovered from COVID and people have come back, it was always going to take time. But what I can tell you is that because of our record investment today, because of the plans that we've got in place, we are seeing that waiting lists are coming down for individual people.
Forgive me.
Well, hang on, this is really important. And I've always said the overall waiting list was not going to come down until next year. That was always the case. But between now and then, we can start to eliminate the number of people waiting a very long time. And then we are making progress on that.
But it sounds a little bit like you're wanting us to believe in some kind of parallel universe. So you say again and again, we are cutting waiting lists, except you've just then admitted that the overall waiting list isn't coming down. Isn't it important actually to say and to admit that overall waiting lists remain an enormous problem, and people's experience doesn't match up with you saying repeatedly that waiting lists are coming down, because they're not in many cases?
That's literally what I said in January, Laura. When I gave my speech about the 5 priorities, cutting waiting lists is rightly on there because it is a priority for the country, because the waiting lists are too high, people are waiting too long. That's why it's one of my 5 priorities. And I was very clear then about what our timetable was to improve things. And we're delivering against that timetable. And I said very transparently and clearly then in January that the overall waiting list itself was not expected to start coming down until next year. But that doesn't take away from the fact that right now, the NHS, as a result of our investment and the plans that we've put in place, is treating more people than it has ever done. And so it just will take us a little bit of time to work through the backlog that built up during COVID. I think people can see that. But look, if you asked again about specifics, people were waiting completely unacceptably an hour and a half for ambulances over the winter. And that has come down to around half an hour. We're close to 75% of people being seen within 4 hours at A&E. Again, that was not happening in the winter.
So there has been progress.
So there has been progress, but I've always said that these things are not going to happen overnight. They will take time, but I want people to know that this is really important, because we've spent now a lot of time talking about the short term. What we're going to do this week is something about the long term, and governments should make the right long-term decisions for the country. It has never been done before. People have always said the NHS needs a long-term plan, so we hire more doctors, more nurses, more GPs, and yes, I'm not going to, as you say, like, it takes 5, 10, 15 years for these things to come through. That doesn't mean it's the wrong thing for me to do, because I'm focused on doing the right long-term things for the country.
And you've made that clear, but in the context of setting out a big, bold, long-term plan, why should anybody have faith that it will work when right now you can't even reach agreements with junior doctors or nurses to keep them in work? And we know so many staff are leaving the NHS, so why can we believe that your workforce plan actually will make the right kind of difference?
Well, first of all, it's not my plan, it's the NHS's plan. So it's the NHS's long-term workforce plan that I'm pleased the government will be fully supporting and backing. So that's the first thing to say. Now, you talked about pay settlements. I'm really pleased that we've been able to reach agreement with over half a dozen health unions representing over 1 million.
With lots of them, and we might be about to have the biggest strike ever.
Hang on, we've reached agreement with over half a dozen NHS unions representing over 1 million NHS workers who accepted our pay deal, which was done a little while ago, and you reported on that. I'm really grateful to all those people for accepting it and for the hard work they do. I had actually the privilege of spending a part of the night shift the other weekend at Watford General Hospital talking to some of the team there, and they're doing a fantastic work. They deserve our support. But more broadly, right, I have to make difficult decisions as Prime Minister. Everyone can see the context that we're in with inflation and interest rates. Now, I want to prioritise the things that are right for the country. So yes, we're investing in the long-term workforce plan. When it comes to public sector pay, I'm going to do what I think is affordable, what I think is responsible. Now that may not always be popular in the short term, but it is the right thing for the country.
Let's talk then about that broader economic picture, because lots of our viewers are desperately worried about interest rates. Now the point of jacking up interest rates is to make it more expensive to borrow, and therefore that means that people will have less money to spend. And it means that people watching this right now are going to hurt. They're going to have less cash to go around. Do you admit that it will be painful for many, many people?
Of course I know that it's a challenging time, and that's why 2 years ago I started talking about the danger of inflation. And that's why earlier this year, when I set out my 5 priorities, what's the first of those? To halve inflation.
I'm asking you a different question though, Prime Minister. And it might be hard to say to people, but I think people look to their Prime Minister for candour and to tell them hard things. Do you admit that there's going to be a lot of financial pain for many, many people? And is it worth it in order to get inflation down?
Inflation, Laura, is the thing that causes people financial pain. Inflation is the enemy. Why? Because inflation eats the pound in your pocket. It makes your paycheck go less far. It eats into your savings. It pushes up prices. It puts at risk jobs and livelihoods. Inflation is the enemy that we need to conquer.
That's why interest rates going up are also an enemy for many people watching this.
Interest rates are a consequence of high inflation, and I think we should be very clear about what is doing damage to people, what is causing people challenges in their day-to-day living and their budgeting is inflation. And it's inflation that needs to be the priority for the government to stamp out, and I'm prepared to do that. And again, that's why it's my number one priority, so people can have some confidence in it. But also, I was one of the first politicians to start talking about the dangers of inflation.
So you are prepared to see rates continue to rise in order to squeeze inflation. That's what you're saying. But do you admit that that is going to hurt for a lot of people? We're inundated with emails saying their mortgage is going to double. We're inundated with people saying that they can't afford their rent. We're inundated with emails from people saying they're just not going to be able to afford it on top of everything else that's gone up. Now, it might be the right thing to do. You said you're prepared to say it, but do you admit it's going to hurt?
So, first of all, with interest rates, yes, they're going up in the UK, and I fully support the Bank of England in their actions. They're also going up in almost all other countries. If you look at interest rates in Australia, in America, in Canada, in New Zealand, all very similar rates to here in the UK. Rates in Europe at the highest they've been for 20 years. So we're not alone in facing this challenge. Central banks across the world are taking very similar action.
But do you think that's a comfort for people?
But let me talk.
That sounds a bit like you're
no, but I'm putting it in
script.
context. But well, no, I'm putting it in context. It's important, actually. You talked about me as Prime Minister. Part of my job is to explain to people what is happening with the economy, the context that we're in. It's right for people to know that's the global macroeconomic context. But let's go to the individual person. What are we doing to help? Because of course, when someone sees their mortgage rate go up, that is going to have an impact on their family finances. Of course it is. And that's why we're putting support in place to help people. Just this week, the Chancellor sat down with the banks to put in place a series of measures that people can draw on. Now, we have the welfare system. There's a support for mortgage interest scheme for people who are particularly vulnerable. But for others, they can now talk to their bank. They can request an extension to their mortgage or a switch to an interest-only mortgage. None of that will have an impact on their credit rating, and it will save them potentially hundreds of pounds a month on their mortgage payments.
Rates have already been going up. Core inflation is not coming down. And the wealthy who've already paid their houses off are going to see interest rates go up on their savings pot. And ordinary families who think they've done the right thing, they've saved, they've managed to get onto the property ladder, they're the people that are going to suffer here. Isn't there an alternative, or is it your belief that there is no alternative to this?
No, there isn't an alternative to stamping out inflation,
and that does require... Is there an alternative to putting up interest rates?
That is one component of what we need to do to tackle inflation. That's what the Bank of England's responsibility is. And it's right that you asked me, my responsibility is also there, and that's to manage the government's borrowing responsibly. Because if I make the wrong decisions, if we end up borrowing too much money, and we talked about public sector pay earlier being a good example of that, if I make the wrong decisions, borrow too much money, that will put further fuel on the fire. of the inflation challenge and will just mean inflation is going to be here for longer, be worse, and interest rates will be higher for longer. Now, so that's my responsibility to get right, is government borrowing. And that's why I have to take what are difficult and oftentimes not popular decisions, but they're the right long-term decisions for the country. I'm not going to shy away from that. I spent all of last summer talking about this. I talked about it as Chancellor, and as Prime Minister, I'm going to do the things that will ultimately benefit country and all the families that you talked about in the long term. Because there is no point, Laura, in me doing something that sounds popular and nice today. For example, on public sector pay, I would be giving with one hand and we would just be taking with the other through higher inflation and interest rates. That's not the right type of leadership that the country needs, and that's not what I'm going to do.
But this week you've told people that it's going to be okay. Do you understand why people looking at their mortgage bills, looking at their shopping bill, worrying about keeping a roof over their heads, are going to listen to you and think, it's not going to be okay for me? Doesn't it sound to many people, or might it risk sounding like you're in some kind of parallel universe where the NHS is getting better and the economy is going to be okay? That's not the experience of millions of people right now.
I've never said that it's not challenging. I've never said that this isn't going to be a difficult time to get through, but what I want to give people the reassurance and confidence is that we've got a plan, the plan will work, and we will get through this. That's exactly what people should be hearing from their Prime Minister and their government, particularly from me, given that this particular issue is one that I've talked about for a while. I deliberately made it the first of my 5 priorities, so no one can say this is not something that I'm not aware of, not on top of, and people should have the reassurance that the plans that we've got are the right ones, because they will bring inflation down over time, and they will provide support for the people who most need it as we go through this difficult period. We've demonstrated that already. Windfall tax on energy companies, which has helped pay for around half of the typical family's energy bill. Support worth £1,500. That is the government stepping in to support people in that particular circumstance, which it needed to. The Chancellor's announcements this week with the banks on providing support to people with mortgages, which they should look up, talk to their banks about, it will make a meaningful difference. Extending your mortgage term, switching to an interest-only mortgage, those types of things for a typical family with a typical mortgage have the potential to save them £100 to £200
so there
a
is
month.
support out there from people's banks if they know where to give it. I just want to ask you 2 final questions. Do you think the Governor of the Bank of England has done a good job?
I think the Bank of England's track record, including the Governor's track record, over a long period of time has been that inflation has been managed appropriately, and people should have the confidence that inflation will fall back to target as it is.
Not all of your colleagues think he's done a good job.
I can tell you as Prime Minister, the Bank of England is doing the right thing. The Bank of England has my total support. Inflation is the enemy for all the reasons that we've talked about. Inflation is what makes people poorer. That's why I prioritised tackling it as the #1 thing that I said in January. And now look, that means difficult things. I could sit here and tell you we could wish it all away, that there was some easy overnight fix. We didn't have to put up interest rates unlike every other country. I could pay everybody exactly what they wanted. We could spend on everything that we wanted, borrow without abandon. I would not be being honest with the country if I said that. That's not leadership. Now, yes, are things challenging? Yes, does that mean I have to make some difficult decisions as Prime Minister? Of course it does. But those are the right decisions for the long-term benefit of our country. Look, I didn't get into this to do easy things. I didn't get in this for the short-term opinion polls and all the rest of it. I get that this is challenging and that's going to have an impact on me in the short term, but we've got to stick to the course, and I want people to be reassured that we've got to hold our nerve, stick to the plan, and we will get through this.
And I just finally want to ask you about something else that relates directly to honesty and leadership. Now, a clear verdict was given by the House of Commons that your former boss, Boris Johnson, lied to Parliament. Now, you haven't given a view on whether or not you agree with that verdict. So do you agree with that verdict? You've just said that you want to be honest and you want to show leadership. So do you agree?
Yes, I've already said, in fact, that I do fully support and respect not just the work of the committee, who I think did a very thorough job, but also the decision of the House. It's right that people...
That's not my question.
No, but hang on, let me finish, because I think this is important. I do think it's right that people, whatever their position, face responsibility and accountability for their actions. That has happened, and most importantly, Boris Johnson is no longer an MP. Now, you asked me about my view on this, right, and standing up for things, being honest. I was a person that, as Chancellor, resigned from Boris Johnson's government. That is you know this better than most because you followed politics for a long time.
But you didn't bother to vote in the Commons.
I didn't because I was actually speaking and attending an event at a fantastic charity called Jewish Care, which does an extraordinary job looking after people around the country.
And you could have gotten your prime ministerial car and gone back to the House of Commons and cast a vote.
Or I could have fulfilled my commitment to these people who are doing an extraordinary job and support their charity and their fundraising efforts, which I had committed to do. But Laura, your point is, do I have to demonstrate my integrity or my leadership? I did that when I resigned. I demonstrated that I was prepared to stand up for what I believe in. You know this, as I said, better than most. You followed politics for a very long time. It is not an easy or common thing for a chancellor to resign from government. I did because I disagreed with Boris Johnson's approach. But look, let's take one thing, right?
I'm telling you, this is really
important.
Your critics say, forgive me, this is important. Your critics have said, I'm not saying this, but your critics this week have said that it was weak for you not to go to back the report. What do you say to them?
I'd point them to the example that I've just given you. Right? There was nothing weak about resigning from government when I disagree with the approach. That's principle. Right? That was me acting on my principles. And actually, I'm not interested in litigating the past about Boris Johnson. He's no longer an MP. The choice at the next election is between me and Keir Starmer. Actually, what I demonstrated by resigning from Boris Johnson's government was that I was prepared to stand up for my principles. Keir Starmer sat there for 4 years next to Jeremy Corbyn saying that he was the right person to lead our country. Right? That speaks to his principles. My resignation speaks to mine. We've been talking about inflation. Important and absolutely right. What's the alternative on offer from the Labour Party? £28 billion a year of more borrowing. That would push up inflation and interest rates. Not exploiting our energy reserves here at home. That's not the right sensible thing to do in the midst of an energy crisis. And giving in to unions' unaffordable pay demands. That would be inflationary and push up interest rates. That's the choice confronting people right now. It's not about the past, it's about the future and who is the right person to lead this country. And everyone can see the context that we're in, and they can see that I've prioritised the right things, halving inflation, growing the economy, reducing debt, cutting waiting lists, and stopping the boats. I never said it was going to be easy. I've been doing this for 6 months, but on all of those things, we are making progress, and if we stick to the course, we will deliver for the country.
And I knew that somehow you would get your 5 pledges in there by the end, and of course the Labour Party would dispute a lot of what you've just said, but just very quickly, yes or no, do you think you're going to win the next election?
Yes. Because I'm going to deliver on the things that I say. And the Labour Party can dispute all they want. They want to borrow £28 billion a year. That's going to push up inflation and interest rates. They don't think that we should exploit our energy resources here at home in the midst of an energy crisis and we should put more power in the hands of dictators like Vladimir Putin. And they also are not prepared to stand up to unaffordable union pay demands. Those are all facts. All of those things would make the current economic situation worse. I also resigned from someone's government when I disagreed with their approach. Keir Starmer sat there next to Jeremy Corbyn for 4 years. Those are my principles, those are my values, and I, unlike anyone else, have actually set out 5 very clear things which rightly you can sit here and hold me account for, which is what exactly I wanted. Now, that is not something that every Prime Minister or every politician does, but I wanted to be very clear with the country about what I was going to deliver for them, and I'm highly confident that we will, and that I'm the right person to do it.
OK, Prime Minister, the Labour Party would dispute what you just called facts, but we'll talk to them about those on another occasion. Thank you very much for speaking to us today and inviting us to the beautiful Downing Street Garden.
Thanks
Thank
for
you for
coming.
your time. Well, what did you think of that? You can email us as ever, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or use the hashtag #BBCLauraK. And before the summer holidays, we'll be talking to the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, on the show too. So if you want to be smart, get ahead, you can send us a question for him. Now, as we told the Prime Minister, we have been inundated with your emails, particularly last week about mortgages and rents. So we wanted to share some of them with you this morning. Tony from Oldham told us, my mortgage has gone up by £700. Any further increase and I will lose my house. I'm earning a good salary, but it's been swallowed. Naya's 22. She's been renting privately with her son, but the landlord's sold up, so she has to leave. She told us new private rent landlords are either openly discriminating against single mothers or demanding 12 months' rent in advance. She's worried she might be homeless. We also got this message from Joseph, who's 27, a newly qualified teacher from the South East.
Given the high cost of property, high interest rates and my low public sector wage, housing just seems unattainable for me.
And finally, Ollie got in touch to say, my wife and I have 2 young children and we're having to move out of London and in with my parents. We have a combined income of more than £70,000, but we can't afford to live independently. Well, let's see what my team at the table have to say about that. Now, I have to say, Ben, you were looking distinctly unimpressed throughout that interview. Fair to say, I think you've never been a fan of the Conservatives, but what did you think of what Mr Sunak said?
It's not so much depressed as sad. I mean, if anybody was still watching after that extraordinary Orwellian, meaningless, evasive word salad, I mean, everybody else wanted to believe, and I sort of believe maybe he's kind of a bit more decent. You know, and it turns out he's as much of a mendacious, narcissistic sociopath as his previous boss. I mean, this man literally, he seems to be making a principle of the fact that he resigned from a government that he'd served loyally and tried to keep propped up for numerous years. He's trying to boast about having worried about inflation while he was Chancellor of the Exchequer under Johnson. He seems to act as being born into Downing Street 6 months ago was a miracle birth. No, he was a part of a 13-year cycle which has got us to this point. He talks about other countries having the same problems. He doesn't admit what he well knows, which is that they're all doing better under them. The evasion, the constant repetition of a repaired street. I genuinely wanted to believe that maybe the Tories had made a reset, even though they had elected a man who had loyally served under Johnson, a man who made a mockery of a parliamentary democracy and clearly was venally motivated by self-interest. The fact that the Tories chose that easy option, for a man now to say, we don't take easy options, when they took the easy option, which was Johnson, because they thought it would keep them in power, and when they thought for a moment he wouldn't, they dumped him instantly. I mean, he's the Prime Minister. He owes us honesty, and we got nothing but mendacity, evasion, and vanity. Just dripping with vanity.
Fair to say that you are not convinced, I think. I mean, Luke, you worked for the Conservatives, you understand the party, but now you spend your time dealing with public opinion. So, spending your life talking to voters about their experiences, what do you think most people will have made of what Rishi Sunak had to say there?
Well, I think what you saw there actually was what the public most like and most dislike about Rishi Sunak. So when we do focus groups, one of the first things people will say about Rishi is, oh, he's really competent, isn't he? He's a smart guy. He clearly gets it. They think he's an improvement on his predecessors. And then they say, my worry is, does he get it? Does he really understand our lives, particularly during this moment when the economy is so difficult for so many people? And the other thing they'll often say is, you know, he's clearly good and, you know, he's clearly good in business, but in politics, is he strong enough?
But do they
why
say
doesn't he? No, they do. They say, why doesn't he stand up to Boris Johnson?
I mean, he's been Chancellor for quite a long time. And is he clever?
Well, he gets a lot of credit for furlough. Like, the furlough scheme comes up in focus groups even now.
So
people say, he saved my job during that. But they worry as Prime Minister, he's not telling them what he's going to do to make their lives better.
It's interesting there, Ben was talking there about the script, the sort of repetition, and it was something I raised with him. You know, sometimes it sounds like a script. Are voters raising that with you? Do people notice when Mr Sunak goes to those lines?
Yeah, that is the sort of thing which cuts through with the public, and it's even reached a stage in our most recent focus groups where people have started mocking the 5 pledges because they say, oh, I know what he's going to say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this, whereas they really want to know, okay, you've got the pledges, what are you going to do about them? And I think he really, if he's going to turn things around, and turning things around will be hard, he's got to lean into what is your delivery plan, Prime Minister, rather than coming across as a commentator, which the public don't like.
Do you think he should lean into the fact that he's been a part of the government for so many years? I mean, that's what rings with me, that they seem to, every time they reset, they kind of pretend that all the problems are new, that they're nothing to do with them, and yet he was a Chancellor.
Well, I don't think he's got a choice but to do that. But if he wanted it to be a reset, he should have voted on Monday. And again, that's the kind of thing which
for the report that said that Boris Johnson lied to the House. I want to come back to public opinion in a second. But Marina, you heard the Prime Minister there quite carefully talking about what was happening in Russia. And we spoke to him yesterday when things were very unclear. But what would you like Western leaders to do? Because you sometimes get the sense they're supporting as they can in Ukraine, but are sort of looking on horrified to Russia, but not really sure what to do.
Yes, you're right. For 1.5 years almost, when we have a war in Ukraine, I can't see international leaders have a strong reaction. They want to help. They accept Ukrainian people in a different country. They have a support. But they still want to keep Putin and at least to have some kind of controlling of Russia. But for what happened yesterday, we can see Putin doesn't control nothing. And most important, if you want to save Russia from collapsing, you need to take Putin out from this place.
Do you think that's realistic for the West to do that?
Just shows this, you're not communicating to Putin as a leader of this country, because he doesn't control anything, and even nuclear weapon might be used without his knowledge.
Very interesting. Let's go back to public opinion, because I know, Luke, you sort of immerse yourself in this, and you know, Ben, you've been talking about your reaction, but there is a sense when you talk to a lot of politicians privately that their constituents, we know it from our email inbox, just sense there's such a kind of mood of grumpiness and frustration in the country right now. Luke, can you show us, you guys do this thing called a word cloud. If you're not familiar with it, you think of one word to best describe the state of Britain. I think we can show people some of your recent findings on this. Look at the words in there. Struggling, mess and broken is the biggest one.
Yeah, and this is what we hear in every focus group we do, in every poll. When we ask about the country, the words that come out are overwhelmingly negative. People think Britain is too expensive and it's stopped working. In fact, I did a focus group last week, and at the end I asked everyone to go around and just describe how you're feeling about the UK and what the government's doing and about mortgages. And the number one word there was shambles. It is this real sense that the UK, it's not living up to its potential. And actually our political class, and this goes right across, it's not just the Conservatives, haven't got a grip on the big challenges we face.
So plague on all your houses. Now, Ben, I know there's a specific thing that a lot of people think is broken. You've been looking at for a new Channel 4 documentary, the trains. Tell us about that.
And again, you say grumpy. I think it's not. I mean, upset and deeply worried. I feel it very strongly. That's why I seemed a little emotional with the reaction to the Sunak interview, simply because of the absolute lack of engagement, of the reality of where we are now in Britain. You know, not post Brexit, post the pandemic, and certainly my recent exploration, which has been into our transport system, which is a vital public resource, a public service, something which, of course, makes a massive impact on the economy and on the environment.
And everyone's lives as well, yeah.
And people's day-to-day lives and their day-to-day jobs. And the chaos out there as a result of an entirely, in my view, an entirely failed project, which is the idea that you can entrust essential public utilities to the mercies of venture capitalists, is deeply personal. I mean, people's lives are getting worse and worse. And to see a Prime Minister, he's clearly not in denial because he obviously knows what's going on, but absolutely thinking that there's the presentation and eyeballs is what matters. As long as I can get my points across, then people won't notice. Go on a train. That's what I was doing over a few weeks ago. OK, and people can see the fruits of your train journeys around the country, I think, on Channel 4 tomorrow night. Monday night, yeah. Now, well, we've heard there from the Prime Minister that he more or less reckons there's no alternative to jacking up interest rates to cool down the economy, even if it is going to hurt. But would Labour make different decisions? Lisa Nandy, who's the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, joins us from Salford. Good morning, Lisa.
Hello, good morning.
Rishi Sunak told us that he thought the Bank of England was making the right decision on interest rates. Do you agree?
Well, look, it's a decision for the Bank of England. The Bank of England is independent for a reason. We've seen what happens when politicians attack our economic institutions and undermine.
Do you think it's the right decision, though?
Their independence. So I'll support them in that. I mean, it's a decision rightly for the Bank of England. What we're calling for is the government to do more to protect people right now from the fallout of their economic decisions.
But in terms of the decision of the Bank of England, you say it's their decision and you support them in that. Do you accept that jacking up rates is going to cause a lot of pain for people?
Well, obviously, when you make a decision in the economy, it has knock-on effects, but that's for the government to take a view of and to act on. What we're asking them to do, especially with the mortgage crisis that's emerged, is to make sure that those measures to provide more flexibility to mortgage payers so that they can remain in their homes, so that we stave off repossessions and real pain for people right now, is to make sure that those measures are mandatory, that they apply to all lenders without fear of it affecting people's credit ratings or fees and liabilities added on top. Otherwise, we think there are about 2 million people who just won't simply benefit from those changes. And so we're asking the government not just to talk a good game about what they want to see the banks do, but actually make sure that it happens.
But is it realistic, though, to expect banks, which after all are businesses, to forgive everybody? There is a situation, some people would argue, where actually some people have borrowed too much. They are in houses that they cannot afford. Is it realistic for a government to force lenders to do that?
Well, this is a long-standing problem. The reason that people are feeling more pain now than they did in the 90s is because the average buyer was borrowing around 3 or 4 times their annual salary in the 1990s to buy a home. Now that's about 11 times annual salary. So people are feeling the pain to a significant extent in the way that they weren't before. But the root cause of that is the failure to build enough homes in this country. We've had various schemes over the last few years that have helped with the fallout of that. The Help to Buy scheme, for example, which boosted demand but did nothing to boost supply. We've had this enormous shift over the last decade from bricks to benefits. Absurdly, we now spend 10 times more on housing benefit every year than we do on building affordable housing. That's why we say that as well as bringing in real concrete measures to help people right now, the government has got to change course and repair the damage of the last decade.
But in terms of those concrete
and why
measures,
we're going to
Lisa,
get Britain building.
But in terms of those concrete measures, Lisa Nandy, you want the banks to have to follow mandatory proposals in order to help out people who are struggling. But the Lib Dems are actually calling for something additional to that. They're saying that there should be £300 grants for people who really just can't afford to keep paying, to keep a roof over their head. And as I understand it, Labour isn't supporting that. Why not?
Well, there are a number of reasons we think that isn't a sensible proposal, in part because we agree with the government that it could fuel inflation, because it's untargeted and very expensive, and we saw what happened in September last year when the Conservative government decided to make a whole range of unfunded commitments that crashed the economy and left people paying the price, but also because Liberal Democrats haven't been able to explain how this would reach those most in need and not others. For example, second homeowners would be covered by their proposals, and they don't have any mechanism to prevent that from happening. We think a much more targeted form of support at those who most need it is far more sensible. It makes much more sense for the economy and for those people as well.
You know, there is already some support for people who are on benefits, who might be having struggle paying. But if you don't back the Lib Dem proposal, you agree with the government that the Bank of England is doing the right thing. Actually, apart from trying to force the banks to do a bit more, basically you're saying the same thing as the government, that interest rates are right to go up, people are going to suffer, but actually we can't really step in.
No, I don't accept that at all. First of all, we got on the front foot and proposed that the government ought to be talking to the banks, as we've been doing. Rachel Reeves and I have been speaking to the banks since the week that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng crashed the economy, to see what more we can do together in order to stabilise the situation and get help to people. And we found the banks pretty receptive to doing that. We're asking the government to make sure that this applies to all banks and all lenders, not just some, by making those proposals mandatory. But most of all, Laura, the difference between us and the Tories is that we're saying that you've got to fix the underlying problems here.
Well, let's talk about those underlying problems then. Which MP told their local paper a few years ago, "I believe it's wrong to consider greenbelt land for development"?
Well, that is a selective quote from a letter that I wrote about a development in my constituency, which made clear that I support the house building programme that my council has pioneered. In fact, they're building more homes and more affordable homes than most places in the country. But I don't support prioritising genuinely green, nature-rich parts of the Greenbelt over brownfield land and scrubland and wasteland that is currently classified as Greenbelt. And that's why Labour is saying that we need to end the taboo around the Greenbelt. There are large parts of the Greenbelt in this country that aren't green. A disused petrol station in Tottenham, for example, that was recently turned down for development in the face of a housing crisis, and we need to give communities and councils far more control over where housing is built
to
stop
the interesting
the loss of the real green belt by stealth.
So this is the interesting point though, isn't it? So as I understand it, your proposal now is to allow what are called combined authorities to declassify green belt land, like the example you just mentioned there. Now, a combined authority, for our viewers, that's a group of local councils. Some people say it's a sort of mega council. Would local people have a veto? Because you and I have talked lots of times on this programme about how much you want to give power away, but actually you're giving this decision to a mega group of councils. Would local people have a veto?
Actually, we'll do better than giving local people a veto. We're going to write it into law as part of our first flagship piece of legislation, the Take Back Control Act, that councils must be involved from the outset in developing these plans. What we've got at the moment is a contrick. We've got a Conservative government that has presided over the lowest level of house building in a generation, with a 17 billion hit to the economy and a major impact on households up and down the country. They've been declassifying parts of the green belt by stealth every year for the last decade. They are the nature-rich parts of the green belt that local people love and enjoy because they're more lucrative for developers, and people have been cut
over this decision?
out of the conversation.
But I want to be specific about this. Who will actually have the final say? Would it be the mega council group of combined authorities, or would it be people at a much smaller local level? Because a combined authority like Greater Manchester, that's huge. That's an area of millions of people.
Well, I live in Greater Manchester, and the process that we follow here is that councils consult their own communities, and that plan is then developed by council leaders.
So that's not a veto, a consultation. We all know that. With politicians consult, they talk to people about what they want to do, and then they hope that people agree. But that's different to a veto.
Well, it's also different to putting communities in the driving seat of what gets built and where. So we'll retain the right of communities to object to planning decisions in their area, but we'll do two things as well. The first is we'll mandate combined authorities to consult at a much earlier stage, so that they're actually showing evidence of how people have made those decisions themselves and not just had them handed to them by people in the town hall. We think that's one way in which you get the right sort of housing built in the right places with community consent and end this ongoing war that happens after the event. And secondly, we'll allow combined authorities to set up development corporations to take charge of the land and reform CPO powers, compulsory purchase powers, so that that land is purchased at market rate and not at inflated rates as it currently is.
Okay,
so
Lisa,
that money goes back into the
lots
system.
of jargon in there, but these are the things that really people care about in their communities, what gets built where, and we know it's going to be an issue in the next general election, and maybe also in the 4 by-elections that are coming. All of Labour's candidates in those by-elections are white men. Does that bother you briefly?
It does, it certainly does. Diversity in politics matters, and I'm someone who stood on an all-women shortlist, and the reason that they mattered and that it mattered that Labour pioneered them is because it changed the perception of what a Member of Parliament looked like. I'm very committed to making sure we can't use all-women shortlists in the Labour Party now, but I'm very committed to making sure that we continue that diversity, and particularly at local level. If we're going to hand power back to communities, the local leaders have to look like the communities they serve.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll see. I'm sure there'll be a conversation in Westminster about that this week. Ben, I know from time to time you've been to Labour conferences. I think you have donated to the party sometimes on occasion.
Yes, I have.
What do you make of
slavishly
them now?
supported, but yes, I do vote Labour, yeah.
Are you impressed with what Labour's putting on the table now?
Well, we've been out of power for so long, but so it's difficult to really sort of see a world that isn't controlled by chaos. But I think they are attempting to present a long-term policy in terms of economically, environmentally integrated, forward-thinking policy. I have great hopes. I mean, the truth of the matter is I think most people will vote this election about the government that's in, and they're going to choose an alternative.
And Luke,
I would recommend that they did, whichever it is.
How would you describe the state of support for Labour? Obviously, the Tories have been behind in the polls significantly for a long time, but where's the public at?
What we've basically heard since Partygate in our focus groups, and you see it in the polling too, is we've fallen out of love with the Conservatives. They're done. There's been too much chaos. The economy's bad. And we're going to vote Labour, but kind of reluctantly, kind of by default, because what they haven't heard from Keir Starmer or his front benches, what are the tangible things that you would do differently to make things better? How would you do things differently? What's interesting, though, is this housing policy is the first time, actually, we've seen a real proper dividing line with the Tories. And interestingly, Keir starting to get some credit from people being like, oh, actually, he's got some ideas. He's willing to be bold. And so I think they need more of that to seal the deal.
The bold thing, it's always the same. Anyone who's in opposition is always, they're untested, what will they be? The same goes, for the Conservatives when Cameron was trying to have a go up there. Well, look at Brown, he has the experience. Who are you? I think being in opposition is very, very hard, and proving yourself before you get the chance is even harder. But current Prime Minister had the chance to prove himself because he was a senior cabinet minister in a very powerful government. Keir Starmer is about to get the chance to prove himself, I think he probably will. But he needs to be more bold.
But Luke,
in his approach.
Briefly, Luke, you know the Conservative Party well. Is it too early? The election can still be miles off. Is there a danger for Labour that they think, oh, well, the Tories are done and it's finished, we can, just take it for granted? Because they could turn it around, could they?
Yeah. It's going to be very hard to turn it around. We are not in a run-up to 1992 situation at the moment. Things are far worse. But there is still a chance. The electorate is very volatile. Remember, only 3 years ago, the Tories were on 55%. Now they're on 22%.
And Marina, I just want to close with you. Let's go back to what we were thinking about Russia. Have you been able to speak to friends there, contacts there? And how are they? Are they able even to tell you what's going on?
It's a very interesting how for last year, many communication been cut. And I don't know, because people started to afraid to call to UK, to be nervous, or even just afraid to talk about this. But somebody who are talking became increasingly just frustrated when I tried to mention your life became not as good as before, or you have some other problem. They immediately became a little bit aggressive to talk about this, even not to mention war in Ukraine. And this is all situation shows to me people in Russia like a hostages. They maybe understand what is happening, but just afraid to talk about this. And for what happened just now might make a sense to understand Putin doesn't give them stability at all.
Okay, what pressure to live under. It's been wonderful to have you with us in the studio this morning on a very big weekend. Thank you all very much indeed. Now, we are not ashamed here to talk about the hard stuff, but we're also not ashamed to say it's Sunday. All work and no play doesn't make for a fun weekend. And more than 200,000 people have been at Glastonbury. Many millions more have been watching it on the box. But there's one 80s icon for whom it was all new. Rick Astley, pop star and meme, was finally given permission to take the stage in Somerset. So what was it like?
Absolutely amazing. It's very hard to put into words. I'm sure everybody says that who comes off that stage. It's amazing. That is possibly the loveliest crowd, and I'm going to use the word loveliest crowd I have ever played in front of in my life. They were so generous, so loving, so amazing. Yeah, just a great experience.
In all your years, that was the loveliest crowd?
Yeah, I'd have to say so. I mean, obviously they're open for anything. I mean, obviously if I play in front of an audience that just came to see me, that's a very different feeling as well. It's a beautiful emotion, but it's different. If you go in front of a festival crowd and they're up for it in the way that they were, that's pretty special, man. That's what everybody wants at a festival, is a bit of a hug from each other, and that's what I just got, a massive hug.
You sound like you were quite moved.
Well, of course I'm moved by it. How can you go in front of that many people and sing songs that I've been around? Some of those songs have been around in my life, part of my DNA for 30 odd years. And that's, I don't want to say a culmination because I want to keep doing it for a few more years, but that's kind of like a definite highlight. And listen, there is the legend that is Glastonbury, and I'm living the legend right now, so it's pretty amazing. I've never actually been to Glastonbury. I've dropped my daughter off here a bunch of times. And I've never actually been in through the gates, and I'll definitely be here next year, that's for sure. Even if I don't need to play, I'll just come and hang out, I think.
You've joked before that you were never cool. Are you cool now?
As big and as amazing as Glastonbury is, it still ain't gonna make me cool. That ain't happening. That's okay, I don't mind not being cool. I'm loving every minute right now, so I always wanted to be cool. Never was, never will be, that's okay. I've got a lot of other things in my life other than being cool, so I'll take them.
I think he is pretty cool, but then again, maybe I'm probably not, as somebody who talks about politics very much. Thank you to Rick, to my panel, Marina Litvinenko, to Ben Elton and Luke too. And of course, thank you to all of you for your company on this busy morning. We started by asking, how is Rishi Sunak getting on? Well, he certainly can't control what's going on in Russia, and we don't seem to have that much control over our cameras here this morning either. But Rishi Sunak has to deal with a very tricky economy, big problems in the NHS and all sorts of other things. We will, of course, be back here this time next week. You can catch up with anything that you missed on the iPlayer, but I'll look forward to having your company again next Sunday. Goodbye for now.